Welcome to Podfic a Week, the podcast of fanfiction audiobooks. This week's fanfiction was recently published as part of the One Piece Justice Anthology and is about the Navy Admiral everyone loves to hate, Akainu. Here's what the fic's author, Chiaki, had to say about the piece. Sakazuki's sense of justice is one of the most iconic in the world of One Piece. As a character, he's always fascinated me. This piece is my attempt to express what absolute justice means. My goal is to give a reason to Sakazuki's action. The piece isn't here to convince you to agree with him, but to suspend your dislike for him for all but a moment, to walk in his shoes, to feel the humanity within the monster. The biggest hurdle while writing this was to differentiate between Sakazuki's absolute justice and the world government's absolute justice. I put emphasis on the fact that despite the Marines and the world government's working relationship, Sakazuki doesn't follow a self-serving ideology. What he does, no matter how extreme, is born out of a misplaced sense of respect for his justice. If anything, it's blind loyalty towards an idealized version of justice and a skewed sense of order. Another thing is that he isn't unharmed by his own actions. He takes no enjoyment out of destruction. Sakazuki understands the weight of his actions, but still takes them anyway. That is the toll absolute justice demands from him, and he will pay it. In any other story, perhaps Sakazuki could have been portrayed as a crusader on a one-man mission to restore order to a world fallen to chaos. But this is One Piece, and his justice has been flawed to begin with, so sadly, he is just an extremist on a mission. It's a tragedy. And now, here is When Justice Calls by Chiaki. War approached over the horizon. Wars were messy, filled with gore and death. No one came out of a war unscathed, be it the victor or the vanquished. He did not find thrills in seeing the ocean turn red, nor did he seek destruction for the sake of sick joy. He didn't want wars. And yet, there were times a battle was needed. Silence fell over Marineford Bay, tense and oppressive, broken by the battle cries of soldiers. The vibrations of sounds thrummed in his ears like the rhythm of a war drum. Eyeing the various spots from which the different angles of the war could be broadcast, the downturned corners of Sakazuki's lips flattened in displeasure. He hated how their mission of justice was being treated like a spectator sport, cheap entertainment. But he understood the need to showcase their strength. Had it been possible, he would rather not. It made Fire Fist out to be more important than he actually was. By attempting to elevate the image of the Navy, Fleet Admiral Sengoku had placed Roger's son on a platform. Sakazuki's eyes narrowed. Quite literally. Fire Fist was above them, put in a position to best showcase his end. There was something inside Sakazuki rebelling violently against the idea. Rationality and emotions didn't always go hand in hand, and he despised how Fire Fist was above justice. He should die forgotten, executed cleanly and quickly. A festering infection needed to be bled out, not whatever this was. Sakazuki still remembered vividly another time, just a little over 2 decades ago, when a different pirate was executed the exact same way. It had created the accursed Pirate Age. The blood of the same man ran through Fire Fist's veins. Like father, like son. Sakazuki had a very bad feeling about this. The announcement of Fire Fist's parentage, followed by the fact that Whitebeard was grooming him to be the next pirate king, caused a ripple across Marineford. Soldiers that had been chanting battle cries were now whispering to one another or looking at Fire Fist in undisguised horror. Foolish. They were the last line of defense against Roger's son escaping death. If they showed fear, who could the people rely on? What was there to be afraid of, except not being able to complete their duty? Sakazuki was also listening, but not to the Fleet Admiral's attempt at heightening their soldiers' spirit, nor to the easy conversation between Kuzan and Porzelino. He was trying to hear the subtle beats of the battlefield. His eyes tracked the big players, waiting for the exact moment the war started. It would happen soon. The unstoppable tsunami of violence and death, and crashing against the shores in a flash of black flags and gleaming weapons. 3, 2, 1. Ice Age. The war had officially begun. On his left, Kuzan's seat was vacant, the frozen bay a pretty good indicator of where the other was. On his right, scattered to billions of vibrant photons, Borsellino went to engage with Whitebeard. Sakazuki let out an annoyed growl as the pair of them left the platform all alone. Engaging with the Whitebeards wasn't their mission. It was to stay here and guard. Sakazuki kept his fingers laced as he took stock of how the battle was going, ignoring the stirrings under his skin. As someone with decades of fighting experience, he would always be prone to feeling restless when the battle broke out. Sakazuki refused to move. He needed to be the immovable wall that let nothing pass. Sakazuki watched the giant platoon cut down enemies, and he didn't engage. Not even a minute passed when one of the Whitebeards hurled a massive iceberg towards the platform. Sakazuki wondered how the pirate expected Firefist to survive, but he didn't care to ask and find out. Clenching his fist, Sakazuki brought forth his power. Great Eruption. His lava tore through the ice, evaporating the frozen liquid upon contact. Gritting his teeth, Sakazuki felt his control over the cooling magma loosen. He released it, flaming chunks of rock pelting down on the Moby Dick and the frozen bay. For the first time since the war started, Whitebeard's and Sakazuki's eyes met across the expanse. Emperor and Admiral. Both of them had something they wanted out of this war, and they would stop at nothing until they had achieved it. Stick to lighting candles on birthday cakes, Magma Boy. Sakazuki's lips curled in an unpleasant smile. Don't you want a brightly lit funeral, Whitebeard? The brief exchange was all they cared to say to each other. Sakazuki had better things to do than to exchange banter with a pirate, and Whitebeard didn't have any interest in talking either. Sakazuki's eyes scanned the battlefield, searching for his target. The different faces of the allied captains, as well as their names and bounties. He was looking for a specific one. There, breaking away from the others, isolated. Out of any other Whitebeard's earshot, this was the chance Sakazuki had been waiting for. Kuzan, Borsellino, Sakazuki called the other two admirals. Protect the platform while I'm gone. The target's at the perfect position for Phase 2. Kuzan's lips twisted, but he gave a curt nod. Borsellino smiled, making a flourish, by your leave. Sakazuki disappeared, blending in with the fighting mass. He weaved through the crowd of Marines and pirates without drawing attention to himself. Every soldier was pushing forward, weapons poised, the cry of justice on their lips. Sakazuki stepped over the fallen, both pirates and Marines alike. Blood had started coloring the street, and it was hard to walk without treading on it. He didn't bother avoiding the mess. His shoes left a trail of red behind, but that, too, blended in perfectly with the hundreds of other stomping footprints. Someone was running back, away from the war, someone in white. Get back to the battlefield. The order left his lips in a neutral tone, with only a mild hint of impatience. You are running the wrong way, soldier. You are supposed to be running forward, not back. Admiral Akainu, the Marine soldier, gasped. Please let me go. Please let me go. I've lost my nerve. I don't want to die. I've got a family. I want to take care of them. Please, came the heartfelt plea. The soldier's voice was shaky, his face bloodless. He had the eyes of someone who had seen too much. Sakazuki removed his cap, letting the soldier see the war scars that he himself carried. There were horrors he had witnessed which he could never forget, even if he was to retire right this moment. Yet Sakazuki was still pushing forward. So did many of this man's subordinates, superiors, and even fellow soldiers. What right did he have to quit? How could he carry the same honor of calling himself a warrior of justice while they laid their life down and he could not? What would happen the next time he faced a strong enemy? The soldiers in this war were the cream of the crop, the ones facing the future. Was this man the best the fleet admiral could summon? A coward. Unworthy. Sakazuki's blood boiled at the injustice of this weakling being equal to the ones lying dead around them. Perhaps even more important than the strength of the body was the strength of one's conviction. This soldier did not have what it took to be called a Marine, let alone one of the best. The Marines didn't have uses for someone this weak. Justice couldn't afford to have someone so pathetic defending it. Its enemies would not get weaker, and its fighters needed to keep up, physically and mentally. "Get back on the battlefield," Sakazuki repeated. The soldier was simply shaking his head, too scared to say no but too scared to return. His lips opened and closed, but no sound escaped, his tongue frozen on the word please. Sakazuki's magma came to the surface. He thought about the families that had been torn apart by pirates, the ones that would be torn apart if they lost this war. Did this fool think his family would be spared if the Marines lost? Had he lost sight of the justice he carried on his shoulders? Sakazuki didn't quite shake his head, but the words left his lungs in a rush of air. "If you care about your family, then die an honorable death." No regret, no joy, no sorrow. The words were spoken flatly. Sakazuki's eyes didn't light up in triumph. The deed was done as fast as he could make it. There was barely any pain. Sakazuki kept walking forward without looking back at what he left behind. He didn't enjoy deaths, but sometimes they were necessary. 20 years ago. There was a silver transponder snail sitting on Admiral Sengoku's desk, sound asleep. Sakazuki had been staring at it in silence ever since he was summoned to his superior's office. Admiral Sengoku didn't seem to mind the lack of small talk, his pen scratching against the forms he was signing, a frown marring his grim features. Alas, Sengoku stopped, addressing him directly. "Sakazuki." "Sir?" Sengoku sighed, glancing at the innocuous object before looking back at Sakazuki. "Are you familiar with the protocol regarding the silver snail, Sakazuki?" The question was hypothetical. They both knew Sakazuki had taken meticulous care to remember all the important protocols the Marines had. It was a vice admiral's duty to know such things, not that some of his colleagues would agree or even follow such a principle. The moment he saw it, Sakazuki had understood. Such a drastic move was always supposed to be top secret. The existence of those silver snails must be kept hidden until a vice admiral had already agreed to take on the burden of carrying out the act. The fact that it laid on the table in plain sight meant the outcome of this conversation was predetermined. Admiral Sengoku knew Sakazuki would not say no. "Yes," Sakazuki answered. The brim of his cap cast a shadow over his eyes, hiding them from view. "Where am I needed?" The buster call was never a light matter. There were Marines who had served a lifetime without ever knowing one. Sakazuki had never thought he would be picked for the task. He hadn't even considered how he might respond to such a call to action. Sengoku closed his eyes, fingers pinching his brows. Sakazuki didn't know if Sengoku was having second thoughts, regretting his decision, or something else altogether. "Ohara." The answer came with a hint of remorse, but the steel in his voice told Sakazuki he was going through with it anyway. "You're needed in Ohara, Vice Admiral." Pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Hadn't Saul just recently captured someone and destroyed a ship full of historians wanting to awaken the ancient weapons? How many more ships must they shoot down for the message to stick? There never seemed to be an end in sight. "You've found definitive proof of their involvement, then?" Sakazuki concluded. Both the world government and the Marines had scrutinized Ohara for a long time. It was hard to ignore the fact that any survivors on those dangerous ships always claimed to only be studying the past. And Ohara was the cradle of archaeology, renowned as the island with the most history books ever collected. It seemed obvious that there had to be some connection. However, they could hardly do anything to Ohara without knowing with certainty the scholars were involved. "At least this time," Sengoku said. Sakazuki conceded to the point. At least this time there was proof. It could be that there were different individual groups trying to do the same thing. There was no way to tell for sure. Sakazuki stared at the snail before looking at his commander-in-charge. There was cold logic to why the buster call was ordered. The Navy and the world government want to make an example out of Ohara. "The ancient weapons must not be awakened at any cost," Admiral Sengoku stressed. "Their power can devastate the world. There won't be anything left to protect. Any one of those has the potential to total entire islands. It doesn't matter if they just want to learn how to operate them for educational purposes. The knowledge must never be rediscovered. Sengoku held the sleeping snail up to Sakazuki, open palm. It was small, laying on his hand, snoozing away until the golden snail was pushed. For now, there was peace. Will you accept the mission? Become one of the 5 vice admirals, leading 10 warships to Ohara, Sakazuki? There was no hesitance in his movements as Sakazuki took the silver snail. Fighting for justice was not a kind pursuit. He had known from the start that there would be difficult choices, and if he was scared of making them, he wouldn't be here. Yes, sir, I'll do it. Sakazuki's voice was steady as he answered. He lifted his head, meeting Sengoku's eyes. Justice will prevail. I'll make sure the sacrifices everyone makes won't be in vain. With that said, Sakazuki took the mission details and tucked the snail in his pocket, safely secured. There was a great irony in this whole ordeal. The Navy and the world government unleashing their closest equivalent to an ancient weapon's power, a force capable of destroying islands with the push of a button, on an island dead set on reviving them. However, Sakazuki resolutely refused to make a joke out of it. There was nothing amusing about this situation. Others might have laughed, though. This was as ironic as irony came. Vice Admiral? Vice Admiral Sakazuki, sir. Sakazuki frowned in annoyance at the interruption of his work. What is it? He asked, capping his marker. The Marine soldier who peeked in was young, fresh-faced and wide-eyed, sweating bullets at having disrupted the infamously strict Vice Admiral. Sir, someone's requesting you, the soldier stammered. He was holding up the transponder snail, its face having morphed into the last person Sakazuki wanted to see right now. He said he's, Director Spandine of Cypherpole? I know who he is, Sakazuki cut in with a small growl under his breath. He didn't have time for this. Just because the warships were moving towards Ohara didn't mean the work stopped. He was still trying to keep up with his vice admiral duties as best as he could. He didn't want to be annoyed by someone from the world government telling him how to do his job. It had been very clear since the first day that their priorities vastly differed. Vice Admiral, I know you can hear me. You can't avoid me forever. It's about the mission. At the words spoken by the snail, Sakazuki's eyes narrowed. Fine, give it to me. You're dismissed, soldier, he said. Sakazuki rested his gaze on the still sleeping silver snail on the table before he picked up the receiver. In a flat voice, what do you want? Watch how you talk to me, Vice Admiral. I'm still the one in charge of this mission. Admiral Sengoku has given me the golden snail, after all. Spandine's voice was as grating and unwelcoming as Sakazuki remembered it. Sakazuki had no patience for power games. He didn't care who gave Spandine the snail. He might be the one deciding whether the buster call started or if it needed to be engaged, but he was using the Navy's power to do it. He stood no chance on his own. As far as Sakazuki was concerned, the power game was already won. With a grouchy growl, he repeated his earlier statement. What do you want? On the other side, Spandine let out a dramatic sigh. Vice Admiral, I know you are from the military, so there are certain formalities that escape you, but surely you understand things like chain of command. Sakazuki's annoyance intensified to something akin to irritation, with a smoldering spark of heat. I'm well aware of the chain of command. You are not my commander in charge. You decide if the call is needed. We lead the fleet. That's as far as our relationship goes. Do not bother me until we reach Ohara. Unlike you, I have actual work to complete. Sakazuki hung up the call abruptly, glaring at the transponder snail like it had offended him. Not even 5 seconds passed when the snail opened its eyes and started letting out a familiar tone. Boodip. For a moment, he considered not picking up the call. But Spandine's words about mission-related things bothered him. If it was something truly important... Sakazuki's fingers closed around the receiver. What? All right. Listen to me, Vice Admiral. Please don't hang up. Spandine's voice was sugary this time. Dripping with so much fake pleasantry, Sakazuki was tempted to tell his troops to ignore Spandine's calls on principle from now on. It seems we've gotten off on the wrong foot. I apologize. You military men are always so... uncooperative. I'd forgotten that. Spandine's words met unimpressed silence. Sakazuki just wanted him to get on with his point. Spending hurriedly continued, sensing the chance Sakazuki was granting him. You see, Vice Admiral, I have always admired military men and women. You sacrifice so much for the sake of justice. I have nothing but full respect for the work you do. We from the world government, Cypherpole, are your allies, not your enemies. We support each other to keep the wheels turning and keep the peace within this world, correct? I don't have all day, Director. So impatient, such a brute. Esteemed Vice Admiral. Spending huffed before the snail was back to giving Sakazuki a fake smile. You see, since we understand each other so well, and I know all the hard work you do, and I support you fully in your endeavor, it's only fair that you support me back, right? Quid pro quo. I'm sure even someone like you would understand that. Sakazuki's eyes narrowed. What are you trying to say? All I'm saying is that I've had quite a number of years being director of CP9. It's about time I pass on the torch to my precious, very capable son, and, well, I know the upper echelons are considering a promotion, so handling this mission right is of utmost importance to me. And out of everyone, you are the most difficult one. So if you would consider adjusting your attitude to be friendlier and more respectful, and listen to my every command for the duration of this. It'd look good on my leadership assessment sheet, and I'm more likely to get promoted. And when I do, I can give you an extra good word or two so they can consider you for the admiral position next. What do you say? We both get something amazing out of this. It's a once-in-a-lifetime deal. There was a pause after Spandin's offer. The snail was grinning a toothy and expectant smile, as if Spandin had complete confidence his proposal would be accepted. Perhaps to him, such a deal was too good to miss out on. The odds of Sakazuki refusing it were 0. For Sakazuki, holding back from crushing the receiver in his hand was proving to be an increasingly hard task as time went on. His other hand was gripping the edge of the table, the wood cracked and bent under the pressure. Anger was too light a word to describe the sheer fury Sakazuki was experiencing. The receiver let out an ominous creak in his hand, the metal squeaking between the gaps of his fingers. Who do you take me for, Director? The question ended in a venomous hiss, only a prelude to the brewing storm. Spandin's survival instincts apparently worked just fine, unlike his morals. The smile dropped, and he stammered for an excuse. Too late. Do you genuinely think I give a damn about your godforsaken promotion or your good words? Do I look like I care about earning a promotion for myself? What do you think this mission is about? It's not about another pretty mark on your assessment sheet. It's the world hanging in the balance. It's justice. It's sacrifices to be made and burdens we have to take on because we were chosen to do the hard job that no one else can. How dare you imply our mission of justice is your stepping stone? How dare you look down on my vow to keep evil at bay? Sakazuki's voice had risen to a shout. Words alone couldn't express how pissed off he was. Shame on you for being a director of Cypherpole when you don't even know what justice means, he snarled. I'll do right by my duty because I know what it is I must do. But from now on, if you ever call me for anything else outside of strict mission-related situations, don't blame me for hanging up on you. Slam. Without even waiting for an answer, Sakazuki hung up the call. Someone get this thing out of my sight. I'm not taking any calls with Director Spandin for the rest of the day. No exceptions, he yelled, eyeing the snail with all the poisonous contempt he could muster. There were clattering sounds before a Marine ran in, picked up the snail as fast as humanly possible, and then clambered out of view. His fury had been heard across the ship, and no one was in a hurry to approach him, lest they be pulled into his rage. Alone in his office, Sakazuki glared at the opposing wall, still seething from the snail call. It disgusted and angered him that this was the kind of man who would be deciding O'Hara's fate. None of the 5 vice admirals accepting the mission had accepted it lightly, or thought for a moment that this was about furthering their own career. It gave them no joy doing this. Sakazuki didn't feel a shred of happiness at the thought of wiping O'Hara from the map with his own hands. But if it was what justice needed of him, how could he deny it? Could he live with himself if he hadn't tried everything within his power to eliminate evil? Could he sleep at night if he ran away from his responsibilities? If it happened, he could never take to the front lines ever again. All his life, he had lived with the singular mission of ensuring justice must be kept, no matter the cost to himself. It didn't matter whether it was the sweat and tears he shed, the blood he lost, or the hours he spent perfecting something. He needed to keep giving. It didn't matter how many times he fell down, he needed to stand back up and continue on. It didn't matter how strong the pirates or how low the odds of winning were. Sakazuki had never hesitated. He didn't run away from a fight, even when he knew he was facing certain death. It was what he had promised to himself. Justice would prevail. It had to. But now, as a vice admiral accepting this mission, Sakazuki came to the startling realization that there were prices outside of his own body that he must pay to destroy evil. Was he willing to do it? Could he call himself a protector of justice if he failed? All the generations of Marines that had laid their lives down to protect this peace, all the trust and faith Admiral Sengoku put in him to ensure the ancient weapons were kept asleep, even the destruction of O'Hara itself. He couldn't live with himself if he turned back against those sacrifices in a moment of weakness. I'm doing whatever it takes to make sure no scholars escape. Justice must prevail, Sakazuki muttered under his breath, fists clenched. The world must keep turning. The sky had to remain blue. The people could not be allowed to know how close they were to complete and utter destruction, even if that meant he must pay the price that didn't come from within himself. He was going to do it because no one else was willing to. Sakazuki's eyes drifted towards the porthole. The world outside that was oblivious to the struggle the Navy faced every day keeping peace. Only a few days left until their fleet reached O'Hara. Sir, maybe you should sit down. It has been hours since Director Spanding disembarked. Besides the evacuation ship accepting people on board, there's no news yet. The ship's captain voiced his thoughts. His eyes shifted between Sakazuki, the silent silver snail laid in plain sight, and the tree of knowledge in the distance. No. Sakazuki's reply was instantaneous. He glanced up at the sky, noting, as a second thought, that it was a beautiful day. The sky was cloudless. The currents beneath their ships were calm. The dichotomy of the peaceful present and the bleak future awaiting O'Hara was almost cruel. Are the cannons ready? Yes, sir. The captain snapped back to attention at the question. We're just waiting for the signal. Sakazuki grunted, dismissing the captain. He didn't feel like relaxing. He couldn't bear to. He was hyper-aware of every passing second. The wait was as agonizing and torturous as a raised guillotine. A traitorous voice he rarely heard whispered maybe the Buster call wouldn't happen after all. There was still a chance for peace yet. Sakazuki's eyes darkened at the thought. He hadn't allowed himself to think about the possibility that they would leave O'Hara untouched. He didn't believe in hope, only in actions. Hoping that O'Hara would be left intact was a useless sentiment. This was not the time. Even if Sakazuki had been staring at the silver snail, he couldn't help the sharp inhale when its eyes snapped open. It started shrieking, a grating sound far different from a normal transponder call. There was no mistaking it. Sakazuki didn't say anything for a moment before he hardened himself. There was an enemy of justice. He was needed on the battlefield. Leveling his gaze at the large tree in the distance, Sakazuki ordered with steely resolve, "Fire." The first shot was loud, shattering the peaceful afternoon. It hit straight in the middle of the target, but the tree held strong. A second shot, also from his warship, shook the entire fleet out of their daze as the bombardment began. The tree caught on fire. black smoke dulling the sky. Sakazuki watched Ohara without a word. Behind him, the soldiers started gathering on the deck, loading more cannonballs, firing more shots. The town, sheltered under the Tree of Knowledge's protective canopy, was also burning. The fire unforgiving and unbiased. It spared nothing. "Evacuation ship spotted on the starboard," a lookout yelled. Sakazuki's attention shifted to the small ship in the distance, filled to the brim with the unknown. It was going to stop at the nearest island from Ohara, and the people were going to be resettled. They were going to live to tell the tale of how Ohara burned because there were demons who had attempted the worst. What if there was a scholar on board? Would there be any reliable way for the world government and the Navy to track them down? The question entered Sakazuki's mind as he eyed the vessel sailing away from the shore, away from destruction. Behind him, the fire cracked, its heat searing. Ohara was a giant bonfire, a torch in the middle of the sea. How far was he willing to go when the time came? How much was he willing to sacrifice when it was his turn to make the decision? Ohara kept burning behind him, dying in a fiery death. The magnitude of its loss could never truly be calculated. Would all of that go to waste if they didn't win this battle? The white coat on his shoulders was heavy, the justice on his back a brand. Sakazuki knew the decision he must take. "Shoot down the ship." His order was final. The captain looked like he wanted to protest, but whatever he saw in Sakazuki's eyes silenced him. He gestured. Fire. Boom. Sakazuki had never cared for wealth, fame, or title. It didn't matter if the world called him a saint or a sinner. He was first and foremost a soldier, and the battle for justice had always been brutal. Was he feeling proud? No. There was only grim satisfaction that he had been strong enough to make the decision. He was from now on to carry that burden. Did he regret it? Would he have done it again if he had the chance? Of course he would have. He would always do the same thing, no matter how many times he was given the choice. It was what was needed of him. He would always answer justice's call and pay the price it demanded: sweat, blood, and tears. "If we're going to do it, we do it thoroughly," Sakazuki began, his voice betraying nothing of his inner feelings. If any scholars had managed to sneak on board, all these sacrifices would have been a complete waste. Evil needs to be eradicated. His words were heard, loud and clear. "Keep it together, soldiers. We have a mission to complete. Continue to bombard Ohara. Do not falter when justice needs us to be at our strongest." "Sir, yes, sir!" Sakazuki didn't look away from the sinking ship. He didn't allow himself to. There was a dark liquid spreading over the water. The fire was too bright, and the ship was too far away for him to make out the color. It could have been anything, but Sakazuki's mind only thought of one thing. The price was steep, but he had paid it in full. Justice would always prevail. The wreckage had sunk, so Sakazuki's gaze returned to what was left of the Tree of Knowledge, charred black on one side, still burning on the other. It would keep burning for a long time, unless they put the fire out. However, the higher-ups wanted to make an example out of the scholars, so that meant the tree would keep burning. Sakazuki, the rest of the vice admirals and their fleet, would have to stay until the deed was completed. No matter what history books would write about this day, or any other events in his life, he was willing to accept it all. He did what he must. Today, Ohara burned, so the world could have a future with no ancient weapons revived. His eyes didn't waver from the remnants of Ohara. He was Vice Admiral Sakazuki. Absolute justice called his name. Present day. "Cut the visual snail's signal!" Fleet Admiral Sengoku's sharp order drew Sakazuki's immediate attention. "It'd be troublesome to have the world lose faith in us. The tragedy about to occur would be too much for the citizens to take in. There's no need for them to learn what's going to happen." It had been 20 years since the buster call that totaled Ohara. Justice needed Sakazuki to do a difficult task once again. This time, it was a mission by the Fleet Admiral, one that he was uniquely suited for. One more time, he hadn't said no. He would never say no to justice, however gruesome it might get. Hardening his gaze, Sakazuki waited for the encircling wall to close in around the pirates, trapping them on the ice. He looked directly down below. As he hadn't diverted his gaze from the burning evacuation ship, he would not look away now. "Akainu." Sakazuki waited for the order. "The situation may not be ideal, but begin regardless." Sakazuki kept his gaze steady. His blood boiled and bubbled up, dripping down to the ground as magma. Blinking through the heat distortion, he raised his fist towards the darkened sky. "Meteor volcano!" The screams began. Fire and brimstone rained down from the heaven, slamming against the ice. There was no finesse in the attack. Sakazuki watched as his magma decimated a pirate, nothing more than a bloody smear on the melting ice. The water was turning redder and redder with each passing second. The kill count could get up to the 3 digits. Fleet Admiral Sengoku nodded, grim but approving. It was war. Everyone had a part to play. This was the role Sakazuki was given. His heart might not be made of ice, but fire coursed through his veins, carrying with it his desire to stand his ground against evil, no matter the cost. For justice, anything went. This has been When Justice Calls by Chiaki. You can find this fic and others like it in the One Piece Justice Anthology, on Twitter at OP_JusticeZine or at op-justicezine.card.co. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you all back here next week for the next Podfic a Week.